The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I have Ben Gottlieb. Ben works for a company called Planted Fresh, which is a plant-based food company. He was previously with High 12 Brands and Lift & Co., which are two prominent Canadian cannabis companies. So he has great experience and understanding of product innovation. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, real pleasure. Real pleasure. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, relatively. How about yourself?
Yeah, good. You have to add that relatively, don't you?
It's funny times.
Yeah, very funny times. Cool. We won't dwell on that. We will get going. So, as is traditional, why don't we start with a bit about you and your background and how and why you got into the cannabis space?
Yeah, for sure. So I actually didn't start my career out in the cannabis space. I started more in the entertainment space. So at a school, I joined a company called Chorus Entertainment. It's a large Canadian media company. You might know Nelvana, which is their children's content studio. They've produced shows like Franklin and Beyblades and Babar and lots of cool international children's content. So I started out there. I was part of a digital team that focused on supporting digital assets with social media and monetizing our IP from Nelvana. So think branded videos, branded games, and all of that was through licensing deals. So I had the opportunity to work on partnerships with iTunes and the YouTubes of the world. So it was a kind of cool opportunity to start my career out at a large company, but I was pretty eager to join the startup world. So after a couple years at Chorus, I joined a company in Toronto that had just raised a seed round to commercialize a wireless charging product. So again, not cannabis related at all, but at that time, it was a great introduction into the startup world. And I was able to wear a few different hats and lead projects in business development and in growth marketing. And then in 2017, I joined Lift & Co. as a relatively early employee. And I believe one of the first in the Toronto office, which had just opened up. Lift & Co. had started out west in Vancouver. But as the company developed and as the medical market in Canada was really starting to take shape and a lot of the early licensed producers were going public, they opened up an office in Toronto. And my good friend Nick Pateras was actually on your podcast not too long ago. So he gave a great summary of the Lyft business, and I can probably kind of jump through that. But I was fortunate to actually work under Nick and some other fantastic leaders in my time at Lift & Co. and help to grow the product marketing team. So kind of the equivalent of a brand marketing team in tech. And so the projects that I worked on at Lift & Co. touched the Expo, the strain review platform, the CanCell retail training program. And it was really an amazing way to enter the sector. I had a chance to work with a really large percentage of the licensed producers on the medical side. And then as we transitioned to adult use, I had the opportunity to work with a number of those same companies as they introduced their recreational brands. And it also gave a lot of exposure to not just license holders, but regulators, ancillary vendors, other advocates, and members of the industry. So I spent time working directly with a lot of different stakeholders. And most importantly, kind of in terms of my job today, would definitely be the license holders and then actually patients and consumers. So definitely was able to kind of spend a lot of time just chatting directly with patients, both in medical and adult use contexts, and had the opportunity to research and spend some time in both Canadian and US markets. And it allowed me to form some really strong views around how the legal markets would kind of come to serve the value chain, product categories, different geographies across North America. And it got me really excited about developing intellectual property kind of through that lens. So in early 2019, I took a little bit more of an entrepreneurial route and got involved with High 12 Brands and some projects where I could focus on kind of brand and IP versus being at more of a kind of hub company like Lyft, which worked with a lot of folks in the space, but didn't necessarily allow me to kind of jump off the sidelines and place bets, so to speak. So it was an exciting time, and I was able to kind of work with a bunch of licensed entities across North America to build supply chain and start bringing regulated adult use products to shelves, which is what I do today.
Brilliant. Wow, that's great. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Nick, because it was Nick that I was speaking to. And I said to him, I'd quite like to do a show on innovation. Who can you recommend? And he immediately said Ben Gottlieb. So no pressure at all. But
that's very kind of him.
We would like to talk about innovation, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so obviously, I mean, you being in Canada, there's the adult use market is probably the main one that everyone's focused on. And obviously in Europe, we're many years behind you guys, so that's probably not very likely to happen very soon. However, it would be good to understand some of the innovations that you've seen across the adult use market, and then maybe if you can add how you think they might be relevant to a largely medical market, which is one that we have here. So maybe if we start with just flour to begin with as a product, if you've got any inputs around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, flour has been a really interesting product in Canada from a medical lens because it was the first product that was legalized through our previous medical regime under the ACMPR. But obviously, consuming flour as a smokable isn't the most ideal medical way to consume. And so there's always been a little bit of a catch kind of related to that. So, I mean, when we first rolled out Rec 1.0, as we've now come to call it, it was dried flour, pre-rolls, ingestible oils, and soft gels. But on the flour side, we were essentially taking a full collection of products from the previous medical market. Some of them were kind of rebranded or names were changed into the recreational market. Some were just drag and dropped directly in. But there wasn't really a ton of innovation from medical to adult use. I would say over the last couple of years, as we've had a chance to settle into the adult use market, where we've seen the most innovation in terms of flour would be in format size. So when we were first starting out, we were seeing a lot of smaller pack sizes, 1 gram, 3.5 gram pack sizes, not great for the environment, not a particularly cost-effective product for consumers. We've definitely had challenges competing with the illicit market on price. And so in more recent months specifically, but definitely more kind of over the latter end of 2019 and into 2020, we started to see a lot of licensed producers introduce value brands and really focus on introducing larger format sizes. So think 28 gram or 14 gram pack, where you're able to offer pretty significant cost savings to a consumer versus some of those smaller pack sizes. But in terms of the flour itself, there hasn't been a ton of innovation. The way the Canadian system works in terms of bringing new genetics or new strains into the ecosystem tends to rely on new licensees doing so with a one-time grace period. And so you'll also kind of find relative to the illicit market a pretty minimal selection of strains and of genetics. And so I would say that the rate of change and innovation in flour specifically has actually been quite slow. Candidly, I don't see too much of a future in flour innovation, at least not in the next couple of years. I think consumption methods, so as people continue to switch over to vaporizing flour versus smoking it, obviously we'll continue to see that trend. But generally, medical users are kind of skipping flour and heading straight to some other more processed formats that are going to allow them to dose more consistently, have more consistent outcomes, and also just consume in a way that's going to be less abrasive to their health.
Yeah, and we'll move on to processed and products and extracts in a second. But just while I'm thinking about it, in terms of flour, is it effectively all direction of travel is higher and higher THC content?
That would be the general trend. It's unfortunate that that's the case, but certainly higher THC content tends to sell much better. There's also a fair amount of demand for unique genetics. You see that in most adult use markets and most medical markets. Heavy cannabis consumers love to try different strains, but there's just been a severe limitation on new entrants to the markets. And so you're very correct in that the primary drivers today behind demand, I would say, are THC content and price.
Yeah. In fact, I read an article on that just this morning. It seems a shame. We've talked a bit about land races on the show in the last few weeks, and had very fortunate to have Dr. Ethan Russo on, who talked about the balance in land races versus very high THC strains, which obviously selectively bred to have those attributes. So yeah, it feels a shame that the market is still focused on the single cannabinoid. But anyway, that's probably a discussion.
I was just going to say, especially as you look at the medical context, I mean, CBD, I'm sure your listeners know, that has a range of purported benefits. And as well as we continue to just uncover more data and as more studies come to light, I get more and more excited about the directional effects of terpenes, as well as some of the lesser known cannabinoids, like the CBNs. And so having consumers not necessarily experience that variety of effects, and more so seek out products that tend to be selectively bred for high THC, as you've noted. I actually think there's kind of at some point consumers are robbing themselves of the full spectrum of experience, no pun intended there. but you're not getting every type of cannabis experience, and certainly not a balanced cannabis experience if you're optimizing for a 20-25% THC product every time, which may not have a very substantial CBD content and may not have a particularly interesting terpene profile.
Yeah. I've got a load of questions, but I'm not going to go there because they're slightly off topic. But yeah, so let's move on to processed products and extracts next.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where I get a lot more excited, and definitely where we've seen a lot more innovation in the Canadian space. So in 1.0, that when we rolled out, we did have ingestible oils and soft gels included as part of that initial kind of product rollout. However, they made up a pretty low volume of sales and continue to do so. They just haven't ever kind of particularly caught on in the adult use market as a particularly strong product in terms of demand. I think there have been some challenges in terms of communicating the benefits, but as well that the adult use consumer hasn't traditionally consumed through oil or through soft gel. So where we really saw a nice bump and where things got a lot more interesting is in last October 17th, 2019, when Rec 2.0 was introduced. So those regulations introduced edibles, vapes, and extracts to the market. And so I would kind of split all three of those into their own subcategories. So yeah, I'll zoom into edibles first, which have been a really fast mover in the Canadian market. The supply has been far less than demand, which has been interesting to see. Edibles tend to sell out incredibly rapidly, both at retail and even more so online. So through OCS.ca, which is Ontario, the largest province's online retailer, edibles are typically selling out in a day or less as new SKUs are introduced into the market. Gummies are definitely the leader in the market, but we see a lot of chocolates. There are a couple mint products. There are some baked products as well. And then beverages have more recently, I would say that kind of falls under the edibles category in terms of how the provinces categorize them. We've seen a lot of beverages hit the market in the last couple months to varying degrees of success. But if we were to zoom out again and just kind of look macro as we've introduced edibles into the market by way of innovation, there's a lot more to talk about versus flower. So there are a number of different encapsulation techniques, different ways of infusing distillate into edible products, particularly in the beverage space. There's a variety of microemulsion, and I mean, a lot of this is trade secrets, so not a lot of it's been made public, but there's a pretty wide variety of technologies being used. The Valence company has published its source technology. They have a really cool white paper on it, SORSE, but that's definitely a leader. There's a company called Sproutly that has a really interesting beverage product in collaboration with Moosehead Brewery. And then on the edible side, we're starting to, right now, I would say kind of flavors wise is where the most interesting things are happening. So some really interesting gummy flavors, seeing cool ways to infuse chocolate. I think the Edison company, which is an Organigram brand, has a really cool kind of bite-sized chocolate product with different flavors that's done exceptionally well. So in terms of kind of onset times and interesting technology, it's early days. We're really not seeing any type of huge trend or huge data that's pointing us towards, hey, this is the best product on the market. This is acting faster. This is more consistent. We really only have a few months of sales data to go with, and we're not looking at particularly well-published products in terms of the technologies behind them. The regulations really restrict what you can and can't say, but it is a really exciting time because consumers are getting to try these products for the first time.
Yeah, and the applications in medical in relation to edibles, is that, it would feel like it's something, putting something in your mouth. We put pills in our mouth all the time. Feels more something that people would be used to. Yeah,
I mean, definitely the edible products I would expect will do very well in a medical context. I think many people prefer a gummy to a soft gel, and they're a lot of fun. But technology-wise, ingestible oils, soft gels, gummies, chocolates, at the end of the day, unless there's an interesting encapsulation or emulsion technology being used, for the most part, you're consuming distillate and you're ingesting that through your GI, and it's gonna hit you in a relatively similar way. So a lot of what I would say the innovation today is more around flavor and kind of delivery versus the actual active ingredients. But again, on the beverage side, that's where we're seeing encapsulation technology that's really interesting, microemulsion technologies. And if you look to the States, certainly beverage technology has been, I would say, a little bit more exciting than edible technology.
Yeah, really interesting. The whole drinks bit is, again, another topic I want to cover, and particularly around the nanoemulsion technology as well. there's loads to go into there, I suppose. But yeah, let's keep on track. Remember.
Yes. So I guess the final piece here would be vapor and extract products, which have been not quite as successful as edible products. I think generally it's a little bit of a higher price point as well with the vape concerns last summer. From a consumer perspective, I think there's a lot of education and certainly a lot of trepidation on the consumer side. Some pretty big gaps to bridge there. But that said, there's still been some really substantial sales for vapor products. And I've been really encouraged to see a product like Dosist set up a partnership here following a number of successful stateside launches. They've done pretty well in the Canadian market. They're commanding really nice margin for their product. And yeah, I get really excited about the medical application of extracts and vape pens, because I think that's where you can take someone who might be a heavy flower consumer. And statistically, a lot of our heaviest medical consumers tend to lean towards flower, despite the benefits of ingestibles. They purport to not receive the same effects, or many of them just kind of have a strong preference. But when I look at behaviors that might replace heavy flower consumption, something like a vape pen or like a dabbable extract allows a more comparable experience, certainly a high potency experience, something that is going to affect you rather quickly, but reduces a significant amount of combustion from the process of consumption, as well as reducing a lot of the plant material. So in terms of kind of the jury being out on it being a healthier alternative, I struggle to even say that definitively, but I definitely would lean in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. And to sort of neatly follow on from that, then, are you seeing much innovation in the devices, so the delivery methods?
Definitely. I think that's definitely where we see, especially for a Canadian consumer that hasn't seen these products before, we're seeing a really wide variety of devices. So you've got your standard 510 cartridge model, which a lot of licensed producers are using. There, even within the 510 model, there's some really cool batteries that have been released, some interesting shaped cartridges. So just lots of kind of, I would say, micro innovations around that primary format. But then you have companies like Canopy and Figure going out and creating their own or acquiring their own unique vape platforms and introducing a closed loop system to the market. Those have done fairly well. So I think it's really hard to kind of benchmark today where demand sits based on sales, because a lot of products are moving more based on availability and where their supply contracts are set up. But kind of anecdotally across the board, we're seeing closed loop systems move, we're seeing 510 systems move, and then disposables are doing really well. Consumers tend to like those as an early product. They're a little bit more cost effective. It allows them to try vapor out without necessarily
not great for the environment though.
Not great for the environment, exactly. So I mean, and the Canadian consumer tends to be fairly environmentally savvy, but as we've rolled out these products, some of the top moving products have been inexpensive disposable vapes. And I can maybe guess that consumers are looking at those as a way to try the category without necessarily taking on the cognitive lift or the financial lift of a more significant investment. But it's also, they're easy products. So there's not a lot of education today around what happens to those products, those batteries, once they are disposed. A lot of that onus it has not fallen on the consumer, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like there's a lot of different products there, and obviously they're probably very suited for a recreational market. In terms of a medical market, something that was talked about quite a while ago, I've seen a few businesses sort of looking at this is metered dosing, so that you can effectively know exactly how much you're taking. So in a medical setting, obviously that's quite good, because a doctor can say, well, you take one shot of this 3 times a day or whatever it is. Have you seen this sort of stuff happen as well?
So I've seen some really interesting metered dosing products in the United States. I haven't actually seen any of them make their way into Canada yet. Dosist would probably be the closest, and Dosist is in the adult use Canadian market. It's not in the medical market. I don't believe it's approved as a medical device. But Dosist, from my understanding, isn't actually a metered dose. It's a time dose, which does introduce a little bit more variance, and probably not something that I would think would have necessarily applications in the medical space. There is a company called Indose, Indose. I know that they've introduced a metered dose pen. They also have 510 cartridges, which I believe allow you to dial a metered dose. So that's really, really interesting. That I would expect will kind of catch on more so in the medical markets than in the adult use markets. It's not as glamorous a product as a Dosist, but certainly performance-wise and consistency-wise, that's a product I would look to.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Brilliant summary there of lots of different areas, and we could definitely go in a bit deeper on a few of them. But are there any other big areas that we missed out that you're seeing innovation around?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't touch too much on dabbable extracts, but I think that's an area certainly where the most enthusiastic cannabis consumers are focusing a lot of their time, but also one where I think a lot of medical consumers might end up moving in the next couple of years, specifically around solventless extraction. I think hash is kind of funny in the sense that it's known almost as a legacy product and has very, very established roots and long history within the cannabis community. But there's almost been a kind of intense reemergence of hash culture and of solventless extraction in the last few years. And as extraction and vape pens and all of these different kind of derivative products have increased in popularity, so has a skeptical eye on those processes. And for many folks, ethanol-based or hydrocarbon-based extraction methods are pretty spooky and not necessarily the type of products that they then want to inhale. And the really nice thing and interesting thing about cannabis, and that something that we know from years and years of hash making, is that really all you need to extract is a little bit of heat and a little bit of pressure. And so we've seen some really cool companies like 710 Labs and Blue River Terps, among many, many others, innovate around solventless extraction. And I mean, they use hydrocarbon extraction as well, but I would say they're best known for their hash rosin products or live rosin products, but products where they're effectively growing plants that are selectively bred for really high yield solventless extraction, and then either dry sifting or creating bubble hash using ice water, but effectively isolating out the most potent parts of the plant without any type of solvent aside from water, if you were to consider water a solvent in that capacity, and then pressing that out on large rosin presses. And it's a very kind of small batch, high potency, high specialization type of production, but it's something that tends to yield fantastic results. And enthusiast consumers are paying over 100 grams or over $100 a gram, sometimes for these products. And then on the medical side, reporting just fantastic results. And so it's all anecdotal, and it's approach it with a healthy degree of skepticism. But there are medical patients who experience fantastic results and tend to publish those results and like to share how hash rosin specifically. So that's like a solventless product that is very high potency and high dose is able to alleviate some of their most extreme symptoms. And so while as a recreational consumer, I definitely see the appeal and am a heavy believer in the product, as we collect more data behind the medical use, I wouldn't be too surprised if we were starting to see some interesting applications for extracts on the medical side, and maybe specifically around pain. But we know that THC can be a really effective pain reliever in high doses. And when you look at folks who are facing kind of end-of-life situations or chronic pain, just anecdotally out there are a ton of extract users that see fantastic results.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the artisan craft end of the market.
Exactly. Exactly.
People who take it very seriously, who want as little kind of chemical interaction as possible, and
for sure,
using some really old school methods. But yeah, I'm sure it's a very high quality product, but probably not scalable, I assume.
You know, it's funny. I think that there actually is a scalability to it. I think if you can capture enough brand power behind it, like a 710 Labs is a great example. They're able to capture really significant margin on their product, and it's a very expensive product to produce, but they have an extremely loyal consumer base. And not only are consumers interested in the product, but they really follow the people behind it. So the extractors themselves, the founders of the brand, those are people that are publishing content, engaging with consumers. They have a hotline where consumers call up and ask hash-related questions. It's really a fantastic community building exercise. And so they've started to be able to kind of license out their processes and find partnerships across different states. And I would say that they've actually only really in the last kind of 12 to 24 months has it started to make sense to scale that type of business. But with their unique SOPs and with the following that they've developed, they are able to really capture a sustained high margin across different geographies.
Yeah, fantastic. We're years away from that over here.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, and that is, I'm talking about probably the most advanced company that's operating in the most advanced recreational states in the US, where they've been the most friendly to innovation. So even in Canada, we're 5-10 years behind.
Wow. Lots to come. So brilliant. Thank you for that really good summary. Really very good, comprehensive. Thank you. So you've mentioned IP quite a few times. What the things that we've mentioned, a few of them, but what are the other sort of valuable types of intellectual property that are being developed in relation to this space?
Yeah, I would really break down IP into kind of two primary categories. One would be strains and genetics, and then the rest would be processes, and really all those other kind of areas we were talking about: processes, packaging, branding, recognition, SOPs. But let's start on the flower side because I find it particularly unique. It's really not an area where one can purchase intellectual property. It's not, you can't approach it as a third-party brand and buy a cool strain. There's really not much precedent for that. And the cannabis community is intense and definitely enthusiastic, and the type of users and the type of consumers that are setting trends around strains are typically those that are following kind of at the farm or at the breeder level. And so strain innovation is constant. The strains that win Cannabis Cups, Emerald Cups this year won't win next year just by virtue of the fact that they're not new enough. So it's something that's constantly evolving. The coolest strains get mentioned in rap songs and kind of all over pop culture. So it's really not something, it's a fascinating area to study, but not one where I would hope that anyone spends too much time trying to kind of nail down a formula because it's quite unpredictable.
I mean, is it genuine innovation or is it just another type of high THC?
I would view there's really genuine innovation in that space. So if you look at a breeder like Mario Sherbinsky, who operates out of California, he's got the Sherbinsky's brand, which is really well known for the gelato strain, which has then kind of yielded a number of different crosses and famous derivatives. But he very much made his name on first the Sunset Sherbet strain, then gelato. And he's very well regarded as one of the best breeders in the space, or at least one of the best breeders that's kind of well known in the mainstream. But it's not just about selectively breeding for THC. His products are particularly known for their amazing terpene profiles and really the taste. There are some really interesting terpene profiles out there that don't necessarily offer the most pleasant taste, but his products specifically tend to taste really, really good. He's also kind of affiliated with the Cookies brand, and that's another one. They came up with Girl Scout cookies a number of years ago, which has been kind of an iconic strain. But where there's certainly a degree of specialization in optimizing terpene profiles for taste and in breeding to create various, and I think there are, it's a bit of a catch-22. I think sometimes folks might be breeding strains to create a similar flavor that exists outside of the cannabis space. Many times I think they're just creating what they create, and then it tastes a little bit similar to Jolly Ranchers, and so they name it Jolly Ranchers or whatever it may be. But definitely with folks like a Sherbinsky's or like a Burner or like a Skittles or some of these guys that tend to be very well known on social media, it's not just THC selective breeding. It's kind of full spectrum terpenes, other cannabinoids. They're really creating products that are world renowned, and they make their way across the globe. I mean, some of the coolest illicit strains that we are getting in Canada right now are things that Sherbinsky was releasing 12, 18 months ago.
Right. Wow. And with the seed genetics innovation, the medical applications are very clear, aren't they, in terms of, breeding different strains for specific ailments. But obviously, unlike the recreational market, there's lots of clinical trials and similar things that need to go behind it to back it up.
For sure. And as I look to kind of the difference between adult use and medical markets in terms of strains specifically, just that the consistency becomes a huge issue. You can test two different parts of the same bud and get drastically different results. So from the medical side, we've done the best we can by using as consistent cannabis as we can. But ultimately, the dosing, it's too inconsistent, not only in terms of THC, but all the terpenes. I would really struggle to see how someone could innovate a strain to be consumed via smoke that would then be consistently treating a medical result in the same way that they could be doing so with a derivative product. I think it's apples to oranges in that sense.
Yeah, the stability and all the variables, and as you say, in one single plant, the top can be very different from the buds at the bottom.
I'm even talking on a specific bud. I've seen lab tests where a left side and a right side of one bud have come out drastically different in terms of terpenes and THC content. So but on the medical side, I think that the strains are interesting, but batch to batch, it's really, really hard to see any type of consistency. But then in terms of the other type of IP, and definitely the type of IP where I kind of focus most of my time, what I'm tending to focus on and where I see a lot of folks in the space spending a lot of time is on different pieces of technology that can scale, that can drive demand, that can drive margin across geographies, and those that tend to do so kind of with a pretty wide amount of inputs that can work within it. So primarily distillate-based products. So I think like packaging is a really, really key one. It's not particularly glamorous, but child-resistant packaging is very expensive to develop. To have a package certified as child-resistant, depending on the geography, it can be an incredibly costly process. And so you see a lot of cannabis companies using the same packages. They're tending to kind of use lower volume orders, stock packages from a few suppliers. Not a lot have gone out and invested in unique packaging. And we see consumers complain about the sustainability of the package. Generally, the designs are fairly weak. It looks a lot like pharma packaging, and a lot of that's based on the regulations that govern. But there are certainly opportunities to improve the packages in the market today. And my partners and I definitely have spent a lot of time attempting to do so with our project. And there are a number of really cool ones out there. Muskoka Grown is a license holder in Canada that just introduced a really, really cool gas can technology into the recreational market that has been in the illicit market for years. So I see projects like that, and I certainly applaud it. I think it's really cool to see a product like that introduced into the market because it's maintaining freshness. It's going to be a little bit more sustainable. Design-wise, it looks different. So packaging is really a key area. SOPs are another one. So when you look at processed products like a vape pen or like an edible, you're typically looking at distillate as the main input for most companies using white labeling today. There are not a lot of folks who are able to do something beyond that and have it poured into different geographies. And so it then becomes a matter of if your active ingredient isn't going to be differentiated, what is your taste going to be like? What is your texture going to be like? The size, the shape of the gummy. So we've invested in custom molds for our gummies. That's something that a lot of folks have done over the last couple of years. And there are some brands that have started to introduce distinct package shapes that have become a little bit more well-known. There's a brand called WYLD, Wild, that has a really cool kind of abstract package that's done quite well in the US. And their brand has just zoomed because of it. There's a company called Pioneer Data that does social media rankings, and it's kind of like a brand awareness popularity ranking across the web for various brands. And Wild is consistently at the top of that list based on them having a really unique shaped package. So it's not necessarily the most advanced things today that are pushing consumers one direction or another at the shelf. A lot of the time it's the appearance or things like the sustainability of the package.
So it's effectively good branding and marketing, right?
Definitely. I mean, good branding, good marketing, a good product, I would say, is front and center. And for cannabis consumers, especially enthusiasts, they're not easily fooled. People don't like to be sold expensive product that doesn't live up to the price. And if they're spending on a derivative product, then they would hope that there's not only safety associated with that. So I think when you're buying a legal edible or a legal vape pen, you're of course expecting that it's been tested and that that's going to be a safe product. But I think there's also just a level of expecting that there's going to be a great experience, that if you've got a vape pen, the battery is going to last a reasonable amount of time. The oil is going to be able to be consumed almost, if not all of the way through the cartridge without jamming up. There's just a much higher level of consumer expectation versus something that's purchased in a back alley or online.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you, Ben. That's been brilliant. And I'm just conscious of time. So my trademark final question is, what did your family say when you told them you were moving into the cannabis industry?
It's very funny. I come from a couple of hippies. My parents both are fairly infrequent but open cannabis users. And so they were pretty thrilled when I said that I was going to be spending some time in this space, especially from the medical side of it. I think that there was really not much downside when they learned. So I was fortunate to come from a fairly biased place where cannabis was quite normalized.
I would say, I mean, yeah, whenever I speak to Canadians, I never get a very controversial answer. It's always very supportive parents, which is good, and I'm glad.
For sure. I mean, coming in from the medical side always helps.
Yes, definitely. Cool. Well, Ben, thank you so much for sharing all this brilliant insight with us today. There's loads more we could have gone into, so I'd love it to have you back on at some point and get to see how you're doing.
Yeah, happy to chat anytime. We'll have some product in market later this year, and excited to share a little bit more about that as well.
Brilliant. Cool. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anush. Take care.
Cheers.